Police closed the case saying my sister ran away with her boyfriend, and everyone believed it but me. My parents, the neighbors, even their friends. They all nodded along when the police said, "It's young love. What can we do?" To everyone, all the evidence pointed to them running away. Both their cars were gone. Officers even found a bag with their clothes left out in a parking lot. But they didn't know Julie like I did. My sister had just gotten her acceptance letter to MIT, her dream school. She was 3 weeks away from her last regional track meet, something she'd been training months for. Julie didn't abandon things. She finished what she started. And her boyfriend Joseph was her biggest supporter. There was no reason for them to just disappear. But no matter how much I brought this up, no one would listen. Not even Joseph's brother Marco, who'd always shut me down saying, if the police said they left together, then they did. Just drop it. But how could I when the case was handled sloppily from the start? The lead officer barely asked any questions and insisted they'll be back with grandkids in a couple of years. When I had pressed him about checking their bank accounts or phone records, he waved me off and said runaways don't usually want to be found. He didn't even search Julie's room properly. Just glanced around and left. The police had closed the case in less than 48 hours. It just didn't sit well with me. So despite what everyone said, I decided to figure out what happened myself. I started asking Julie's friends what they remembered from that last week. 3 of them said the same thing. Julie and Joseph had been acting strange, jumpy, like they were scared of something. One friend said Julie acted distracted in class. Another said Joseph had stopped showing up to band practice when he'd never missed it, not even when he was sick. When I asked if they knew why, they just shrugged. I tried asking other people again. Neighbors, parents, even the officer in charge of the case. But every lead went nowhere. And it quickly felt like no one cared anymore. That everyone had moved on except for me. So after another week of dead ends, I wandered off to the secret playground Julie and I used to go to as kids, sat on the swings and just cried. But as I got up, I spotted it, writing on the swing set pole in black permanent marker. My heart stopped when I recognized the handwriting. It was Julie's. I was positive. No one else in the world placed a dot inside their P's and D's. I leaned close to read it. Help. Followed. Trouble. J plus J. Julie and Joseph. I started walking around the playground and found more notes scratched into the metal. Dates, initials, and a few random numbers and letters written over and over everywhere. I took pictures of everything and drove straight to Marco's house. I shoved my phone in his face. Clues. We can save Julie and your brother if we can figure this all out. He stared at the photos, and this time, he didn't call me crazy or turned me away. We spent hours going through the notes. The coordinates led to different locations around town. The dates matched up with when they disappeared. And then we deciphered it. A car plate number and 2 names. One of them was the lead officer who'd dismissed the case. Checkmate, I whispered, feeling more hopeful than ever. Marco and I decided to follow the officer's car the next evening. Most of the day went normally. His route literally just circled 4 streets over and over. But then, around 4 p.m., his car suddenly took a different turn, driving out of town and into the woods. We stayed far back and killed our headlights when he turned down a dirt road. The car stopped at a small house hidden in the trees. We parked behind shrubs and trees and crept closer, my heart racing hard against my chest. We walked over to the back of the house and peeked through a small basement window. That's when I saw them. Julie and Joseph tied to chairs. Hope you guys had a good sleep, the officer chuckled, walking around them. Tonight we're finally delivering you. We'll be taking your fresh young organs very soon. Aren't you happy? You'll be saving lives. He laughed at their scared expressions. Marco grabbed my arm. I know what you're thinking, but don't. Let's call the real police and leave it to them. I yanked my arm back. No, I'm done relying on them. We're saving them now. You're insufferable, he shook his head. And you're welcome, I replied. We waited until the officer and the other guy went upstairs. Then we broke open the locked outdoor basement entrance and climbed through. Julie's eyes went wide when she saw us. I grabbed the officer's keys off a hook by the door and cut the zip ties with the serrated end. We ran out the basement just as footsteps started getting close and dashed towards our car. Julie and Joseph had fallen asleep on the ride to the police station, exhaustion clear on their faces. We burst into the station and told them everything. The house, the woods, the organ operation. They instantly sent a team to search for the house and officers. But by the time they got there, the house was empty, and the 2 men had escaped. However, 2 days later, I spotted him at the place I least expected it. He grinned at me and held up a red flower. Full story on channel linked below. I stood frozen in the parking lot outside the grocery store, my shopping bag slipping from my hand and hitting the pavement. The corrupt officer grinned at me from maybe 20 feet away, holding up a single red flower like it was some kind of sick trophy. My fingers fumbled for my phone in my jacket pocket, shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I pressed Marco's contact and lifted it to my ear, not taking my eyes off the officer for even a second. He tilted his head at me, that grin getting wider, then turned and walked away into the crowd of shoppers heading toward their cars. Marco picked up on the second ring, and I forced the words out past the tightness in my throat, telling him where I was and what just happened. He said he'd be there in 10 minutes and told me to get inside my car and lock the doors. I grabbed my shopping bag off the ground and ran to my car, fumbling with the keys before finally getting inside and hitting the lock button. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Marco's truck pulled up next to me exactly 9 minutes later, and I jumped out to meet him. We drove straight to the FBI field office that had opened a case after the local police completely failed us. Agent Maddie Landry met us in a small conference room with gray walls and a table that had coffee rings on it. She listened to everything I said about seeing the officer, about the red flower, about how he just stood there grinning like he wanted me to know he could get to me whenever he wanted. Her partner Nadia came in while I was talking and started asking me specific questions about the exact location, what the officer was wearing, which direction he walked. They sent someone to pull security footage from the grocery store and the shops around it within 20 minutes. Maddie made some calls and told us they were putting protection details on all of us immediately. Me and Marco and Julie and Joseph. She said the officer showing himself like that was a direct threat and they weren't taking any chances. A hospital security guard named Kenji Owens got assigned to watch Julie and Joseph's room while they finished their observation period. 2 FBI agents started rotating shifts outside my house, and another team did the same at Marco's place. One of them followed me everywhere I went for the next 3 days. Julie and Joseph got released from the hospital after 72 hours of tests and monitoring for dehydration and some minor injuries from the zip ties. The doctors said they were lucky, that 3 more days without food and water could have caused serious organ damage. They moved into a safe house on the edge of town with agents stationed outside around the clock. I got permission to visit with my security detail escorting me there and back. The safe house was a small ranch-style place with brown siding and curtains that stayed closed all the time. Julie sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket even though it wasn't cold, and I sat next to her while Joseph made tea in the kitchen. She finally told me everything about the weeks before they disappeared. They'd noticed a man following them after track practice, always staying far back but showing up too many times to be coincidence. The same man turned out to be Giles Mercer, the corrupt officer's accomplice. Julie said they'd see him in parking lots, outside the school, once even near our house just sitting in a car watching. Joseph came back with 3 mugs of tea and sat on Julie's other side. He explained how they went to the police station to report the stalking, scared and hoping someone would help them. The corrupt officer himself took their report, wrote everything down, then told them it was probably just paranoia from stress about college and graduation. He said young people often imagine things when they're under pressure. 2 days after that police visit, someone grabbed them in a parking lot after Julie's evening run. She'd stopped to stretch near her car and Joseph was waiting inside it. They felt a sting in their necks, saw a man's face for just a second, then everything went black. When they woke up, they were in that basement tied to chairs with the corrupt officer standing over them, telling them how valuable their young, healthy organs would be. Agent Maddie came to the safe house the next day and sat with all of us in the living room. She explained that the red flower was a signature used by a trafficking network operating across 3 states. The corrupt officer showing it to me wasn't random or stupid. It was both a threat and a taunt, his way of proving he was still connected to the larger organization even though he was on the run. The flower meant they were still watching, still operating, still dangerous. Maddie said they were working with other field offices to map out the entire network and shut it down completely. Nadia's forensic team had spent days processing the hidden house in the woods where we found Julie and Joseph. She came by the safe house that same afternoon with a thick folder of reports and photos. The DNA evidence revealed at least 6 other victims had been held in that basement over the past 2 years. Blood samples, hair, skin cells, all cataloged and matched to missing persons reports from surrounding counties. The FBI realized this trafficking ring had been operating way longer than anyone suspected, protected the whole time by the corrupt officer using his position to shut down investigations and cover up disappearances. I went back to the school on Monday with one of my security detail agents following me in an unmarked car. Walking through the hallways felt wrong with everyone staring and whispering. Teachers pulled me aside between classes to say they were glad Julie was safe and ask if I needed extensions on assignments. My classmates were split between treating me like some kind of hero who saved her sister and treating me like I'd brought danger into our town. Sarah Choi, who I'd known since elementary school, actually crossed to the other side of the hallway when she saw me coming. But Janeth Rodriguez hugged me and said what I did was brave. I just wanted everything to feel normal again. But normal was gone and wasn't coming back anytime soon. Marco stopped by my house every evening that week, usually around 7 when his classes and my homework were done. He looked tired all the time, dark circles under his eyes like he wasn't sleeping. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about how he'd shut me down at the beginning, how he'd dismissed everything I said about Julie and Joseph not running away. If he'd listened sooner, maybe they wouldn't have suffered as long. I told him we got them back and that's what mattered, but I could see the guilt eating at him. He started spending hours at the FBI field office reviewing evidence and creating timelines that connected different victims and locations. Maddie said his pattern recognition skills were actually helping them see connections they'd missed, that his timeline of the corrupt officer's patrol routes matched up with when several victims disappeared. Marco threw himself into the investigation like if he worked hard enough, he could make up for not believing me sooner. The next day, the station captain called a press conference at City Hall. I watched it on the local news channel with my parents standing behind the couch. The captain looked tired, older than I remembered from the few times I'd seen him around town. He stood at a podium with microphones pointed at him and admitted the department had failed Julie and Joseph. He said the investigation was handled wrong from the start, and that everyone who worked closely with the corrupt officer was being put on leave while the FBI looked into what they knew. He promised full cooperation with the federal investigation and said new protocols would be put in place for missing persons cases. My mom squeezed my shoulder when he finished talking. That afternoon, Agent Maddie brought someone new to the safe house where Julie and Joseph were staying. She introduced him as Joe Landry, her retired detective father who'd worked major cases for 30 years before he left the force. He had gray hair and wore reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose while he reviewed all the evidence spread across the dining room table. He studied the photos from the hidden house, read through witness statements, and looked at the timeline Marco had created connecting different disappearances. After 2 hours, he told Maddie the trafficking network had to have contacts inside hospitals, morgues, and medical transport companies across the whole region. He pointed to specific details in the reports that showed someone with medical knowledge was coordinating everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the corrupt officer's face grinning at me in the parking lot, holding that red flower like it was some kind of sick joke. I woke up 3 times in a panic, my sheets soaked with sweat, convinced I heard footsteps outside my window. The 3rd time, my dad came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed until I calmed down. The next morning, a security company came to install cameras around our house and sensors on all the doors and windows. My dad started sleeping on the couch near the front door with his phone on the coffee table, ready to call for help if anything happened. The following week, Julie started going to therapy sessions with Laura Landry, a woman who worked with people who'd survived trafficking. Julie went 3 times that first week and came home exhausted every time, her eyes red from crying. She told me the sessions were really hard because Laura made her talk about being in that basement, about being scared they were going to die, about all the things the corrupt officer said to them. But Julie said she needed to do it, that she couldn't let what happened control the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Joseph's family was dealing with everything in their own way. His parents kept switching between being so grateful he was alive and being furious that no one had been arrested yet. His mom called Agent Maddie every single day asking for updates. His dad wanted to hire private investigators to find the corrupt officer faster. Marco became the calm one in his family, the person who managed his parents' emotions while making sure Joseph had space to recover. He'd come over to my house after dealing with his parents' latest outburst, and we'd just sit quietly, both of us too tired to talk about everything happening. During this time, the FBI was tracing the corrupt officer's financial records. Maddie came by one afternoon and showed us what they'd found. The corrupt officer had been receiving payments from a shell company that investigators linked to illegal organ brokers. The amounts matched up perfectly with dates when missing persons reports were filed in surrounding counties. They'd created a timeline showing at least 8 victims over 18 months, all young and healthy like Julie and Joseph. The same financial records helped Nadia identify the second man who'd escaped from the hidden house. She matched fingerprints found on door handles and light switches to someone named Giles Mercer. He had a criminal record for medical fraud and had worked as a surgical technician before losing his license 5 years ago. That background gave him the knowledge needed to check if people would be good organ donors. Maddie said he was the one who probably examined Julie and Joseph to determine what organs could be harvested. 3 weeks after the rescue, Agent Maddie got a break in the case. A woman who lived near the hidden house finally came forward after seeing news coverage about the trafficking ring. She remembered seeing a white refrigerated medical transport van making trips to that location over several months. She'd thought it was weird at the time because there was no hospital or medical facility anywhere near those woods. The van's company was based 2 states away and had no legitimate reason to be in our area. The FBI started investigating the transport company immediately. 2 days later, I sat in Prosecutor Catalina Richards' office downtown for an interview about the case. She was building charges against everyone involved in the trafficking ring and needed my testimony. She asked me to walk through everything from the moment I realized Julie wouldn't just run away to finding the clues at the playground to following the corrupt officer's car to the rescue. She explained that my testimony about finding the evidence and doing surveillance would be crucial for establishing the timeline and proving the corrupt officer was directly involved. She said the trial would probably happen in about 6 months, and that I'd need to testify in front of a jury. That evening, Julie sat at her desk staring at her laptop screen for almost an hour before she finally started typing. She was writing an email to MIT asking to defer her acceptance by 1 year. Tears ran down her face while she wrote it, but she said she needed to be mentally strong before taking on the pressure of her dream school. She needed time to recover and to testify at the trials without worrying about grades and assignments. She hit send and then cried harder, and I sat next to her holding her hand while she processed giving up something she'd worked toward for years, even though it was just delayed and not gone forever. Joseph came over the next morning and told Julie he was staying. He'd already talked to the community college about classes and said he wanted to be close while they both healed. Julie hugged him and cried again, but this time it wasn't sad crying. They spent the rest of the day on the couch just being together, not talking much, just holding hands and watching movies they'd seen 100 times before. I could see something had changed between them. They weren't just boyfriend and girlfriend anymore. They were two people who survived something terrible together, and that bond was different. Stronger. Marco started texting me every morning asking how I slept and if I felt safe. At first I thought it was weird, but then I realized he got it in a way my other friends didn't. He'd been there in the woods. He'd seen Julie and Joseph tied to those chairs. He understood why I jumped when doors slammed or why I checked over my shoulder in parking lots. We met for coffee twice a week and just talked about normal stuff, but also about the fear that still sat in our chests like a weight. He told me he felt guilty for not believing me sooner, and I told him we saved them, and that's what mattered. The FBI raided the medical transport company 6 days after finding the financial records. Agent Maddie called me that afternoon and said they'd found refrigeration units in the warehouse with organs inside. No paperwork. No documentation showing where the organs came from or where they were going. 5 employees got arrested on the spot, and 2 of them started talking immediately, offering to cooperate if they got lighter sentences. Maddie said the investigation was expanding faster than they'd expected. One of the employees who cooperated sat in an interrogation room and explained the whole operation to the FBI. He said the corrupt officer and Giles Mercer were the acquisition team. They identified healthy young people and grabbed them. Then they'd take the victims to a mobile surgical facility that moved locations every few weeks to avoid detection. The organs got harvested there and sold to desperate patients through illegal networks. The employee said he just drove the refrigerated van and never asked questions, but he knew at least 8 people had gone through the facility in the past year. Agent Maddie showed up at my house 2 days later with a folder full of photos. She spread them across our kitchen table and asked if Julie or Joseph had mentioned seeing anyone else during their captivity. The photos showed 8 missing young people from surrounding counties. All of them were between 18 and 25. All of them had disappeared in the past 18 months with cases that got closed as runaways. I called Julie and she came over with Joseph. She looked at the photos for a long time before pointing to 2 of them. She said she'd seen them briefly when Giles Mercer brought food to the basement. They'd been in a van outside and she'd only caught a glimpse through a window, but she was sure it was them. Maddie wrote down everything Julie remembered. The FBI held a meeting at their field office and I sat in because Maddie said I'd earned the right to know what was happening. Joe Landry was there too. He was Maddie's dad and a retired detective who'd been consulting on the case. He suggested they check recent rentals of industrial spaces with enough power for medical equipment and climate control systems. He said the mobile facility would need those things to function, and somebody had to be paying for the space. Agents started pulling rental records from 3 counties. Going back to the school felt wrong. I sat in classes trying to focus on algebra and history while knowing the corrupt officer was still out there somewhere. My security detail followed me everywhere. 2 agents in a dark car that parked outside my house at night and drove behind the bus in the morning. They waited in the school parking lot all day. I couldn't forget about the danger for even a minute because they were always there reminding me. I jumped every time someone walked up behind me in the hallway. My friends noticed but didn't know what to say. Julie went to therapy twice a week with Laura Landry. Most sessions went okay, but one day Laura asked her to describe the basement where they'd kept her. Julie started talking and then suddenly she couldn't breathe. Her chest got tight and her hands started shaking and she said the room was spinning. Laura called Joseph and he rushed over from his class. He sat next to Julie and held her hand and talked her through it. He reminded her where she was and that she was safe. He described the therapy office in detail until Julie's breathing slowed down. They worked through the memory together with Joseph there supporting her. Laura said it was actually good that it happened because now they could process it properly. Marco showed up at my house one evening with his laptop. He'd been doing his own research on the corrupt officer and found something the FBI had missed. The officer had a sealed juvenile record that Marco accessed through some creative searching. There was also a complaint filed against him 5 years ago for using too much force during an arrest. The complaint got dismissed, but Marco said it showed a pattern. The officer had always been violent and abused his authority, but nobody had stopped him. We called Agent Maddie and she came over to look at what Marco had found. She took photos of everything and said it would help build the case. The FBI's financial team traced the shell company's payments for 3 weeks. They followed the money through 6 different accounts before finding the final destination. An offshore account controlled by a doctor who'd lost his medical license in another country for doing surgeries that violated ethics rules. Agent Maddie said his name was Dr. Victor Petrov, and he'd been kicked out of 3 countries for similar violations. She showed me his photo and said he was almost certainly the surgeon performing the organ harvesting. The FBI put out an international alert for him. They had the whole network mapped now. The corrupt officer and Giles Mercer grabbed the victims. Dr. Petrov harvested the organs at the mobile facility. The transport company moved everything, and dozens of people bought the organs through illegal brokers. Maddie said they were close to finding the mobile facility, and once they did, the whole operation would collapse. 4 weeks after we found the mobile facility location, Agent Maddie called me at 6 in the morning. The FBI was moving in on an abandoned veterinary clinic 2 hours away, and she wanted me to know before it hit the news. I sat by my phone for 3 hours waiting for updates, my leg bouncing the whole time. Marco showed up with coffee and we waited together. Agent Maddie finally called back around noon and said they got the doctor plus 2 nurses and someone who put people to sleep for surgeries, but the corrupt officer and Giles Mercer weren't there. The place had been cleared out recently. Like maybe they knew the FBI was getting close. I felt relieved they caught more people, but also sick knowing those two were still out there somewhere. Agent Maddie came by that evening with Nadia to show us photos of what they found at the clinic. Metal tables with restraints, medical equipment for cutting and stitching, coolers for transporting organs. Nadia explained they found records hidden in a locked cabinet that listed 12 different victims over the past year and a half. Some of them survived having a kidney taken or part of their liver cut out. Others died right there on the table, and Nadia said investigators were still trying to figure out where the bodies ended up. I looked at the list of names and felt my stomach twist. Julie and Joseph were supposed to be numbers 13 and 14. 2 days later, prosecutor Catalina Richards asked me and Marco to come to her office downtown. She had short dark hair and wore a gray suit that made her look serious and official. She spread out folders across her desk and explained she was filing charges against everyone the FBI arrested, including conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, organ trafficking, and kidnapping. The trials would take over a year to finish, she said, because there was so much evidence to go through. The corrupt officer and Giles Mercer would be tried separately once the FBI caught them. She asked if we understood what testifying would mean, and I nodded. Marco said we were ready to do whatever it took. The mail came 3 days after that meeting, and I grabbed it from the box like always. Bills, advertisements, a magazine for my dad, and then a plain white envelope with no return address. The postmark said it came from 3 states away. I opened it standing right there by the mailbox, and a dried red flower petal fell out onto my hand. The note inside had 5 words written in block letters. You took something from us. My hand started shaking so bad I dropped everything on the ground. I ran inside and called Agent Maddie, barely able to get the words out. She arrived with 2 other agents within 20 minutes, and they took the envelope and petal as evidence. Agent Maddie told my parents they were increasing my security detail immediately, and that she'd be tracing where the letter came from. That night I couldn't sleep at all. Just kept thinking about how the corrupt officer knew where I lived and was sending me threats. 2 days later, Agent Maddie came back and said the FBI was setting up surveillance in the city where the letter was postmarked. They hoped the corrupt officer or Giles Mercer would make another move and the FBI could grab them. But until then, the threat level against me had gone up too much. I needed to move to a temporary safe house with my parents. We packed bags that same day, and 2 agents drove us to a small house on the edge of town that looked totally normal from the outside, but had cameras everywhere and reinforced locks on all the doors and windows. My mom cried the whole drive there. My dad kept his hand on her shoulder and didn't say anything. I just stared out the window and wondered how long we'd have to hide. The next week, Julie and Joseph went to the prosecutor's office to give their formal depositions. It took 2 full days, and they had to describe every single detail of what happened when they were grabbed, what the basement looked like, what they heard the corrupt officer and Giles Mercer say about the organ operation. Prosecutor Catalina Richards let me sit in the waiting room while they did it. Joseph came out after the first day looking exhausted, his eyes red like he'd been crying. Julie emerged an hour later and just hugged me without saying anything. The second day was even harder. I could hear Julie's voice through the door sometimes, shaky and quiet. But when they finished, both of them said they felt better having told everything officially, like they were finally doing something that mattered for the case. Marco showed up at the safe house the next evening with his own bag. Agent Maddie told him he was considered at risk too since he helped with the investigation and rescue. His parents didn't want him staying alone at their house where someone could find him. So now it was me, my parents and Marco all crammed into this small safe house with agents rotating shifts outside. Marco and I spent hours in the living room talking about everything that happened, trying to process how scared we still felt, and how angry we were that the corrupt officer was still free. We talked about what normal life even meant anymore, and whether we'd ever feel safe again. It helped having someone who understood exactly what I was going through. Agent Maddie came by after a week to update us on the investigation. Her team had been going through security footage and talking to witnesses in different towns. They found a pattern in where the corrupt officer had been spotted. He was staying in cheap motels and only using cash, so nobody could track his credit cards. But he kept going back to areas near where previous victims had lived, like he couldn't stay away from the places connected to the operation. Agent Maddie said it meant he was obsessed with what he'd lost, and that made him even more dangerous. Meanwhile, the disgraced doctor they arrested at the clinic started cooperating with prosecutors. He told them the corrupt officer wasn't just someone who grabbed victims. He was the enforcer who got rid of anyone who threatened to expose the operation. 2 unsolved murders in the region were now being looked at again as possible victims of the corrupt officer's violence. Agent Maddie showed me photos of the 2 people who'd been killed, and I felt sick thinking about how close Julie and Joseph came to ending up the same way. After hearing all that, I started having sessions with Laura too. She was the same therapist Julie was seeing, and she specialized in helping people who'd been through bad situations. I told her I couldn't sleep without checking the locks 3 times, and that I jumped every time I heard a car door close outside. Laura taught me some breathing exercises and ways to calm down when my brain started spinning with fear. She explained that my body's alarm system was stuck in overdrive after weeks of real danger, and that it would take time to convince it that I was actually safe now. The sessions helped a little, but I still felt on edge all the time, waiting for the next threat to show up. 5 weeks passed in that strange routine of safe house life and constant fear. Agent Maddie called me one morning with news that made my hands shake. A woman working at a bus station 3 states away spotted someone matching Giles Mercer's description, trying to buy a ticket to Mexico using a fake ID. FBI agents got there in under an hour and grabbed him before he could board the bus. He didn't even try to run, just stood there looking relieved when they put the handcuffs on. Agent Maddie said he actually thanked them for arresting him before the corrupt officer could find him first. The interrogation started immediately. Giles sat in that FBI interview room and spilled everything without even waiting for his lawyer. He was scared out of his mind, kept saying the corrupt officer had been sending him threatening messages ever since our rescue, blaming him for not stopping us. He gave them names, locations, bank account numbers, contacts across multiple states. Then he described what the corrupt officer looked like now: beard covering half his face, glasses with thick black frames, hair dyed from brown to almost black. The FBI sketch artist worked with Giles for hours, creating an updated picture that looked nothing like the clean-cut officer I remembered from the police station. They sent that new image to every law enforcement agency in 5 states. Put up a reward of $50,000 for information leading to his capture. The news coverage picked up again with the arrest and the new description. My phone buzzed constantly with people from the school sending me links to articles. Within days of Giles cooperating, the FBI moved on 3 more locations he told them about. One was a storage unit filled with medical equipment. Another was an apartment where someone had been keeping detailed records of victim information. The third was a house where they found 2 people actively preparing to transport someone across state lines. 5 arrests total from those raids. Agent Maddie showed me photos of the people they caught. None of them looked like criminals. Just normal people you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But they'd all been part of moving victims and connecting them with desperate patients willing to pay anything for organs off the illegal market. Meanwhile, Julie started making plans to finish high school. She'd missed too much at her old school to catch up, so she enrolled at mine for senior year. It felt weird seeing her in the hallways between classes. She'd always been at the other school across town, and now she was right there where I could check on her anytime. Part of me felt better having her close. The other part hated that she needed to transfer because of what happened. She tried to act normal, joining me for lunch and walking to classes, but I saw how she jumped when lockers slammed or someone came up behind her too fast. Joseph got himself into community college and found a part-time job at a bookstore downtown. He told Marco he needed structure and routine to feel like a real person again. Every night, he and Julie video chatted for at least an hour. Sometimes I'd walk past Julie's room and hear them just talking about their days, processing everything out loud with each other. They'd gotten so much closer through the whole nightmare. Their relationship wasn't just high school dating anymore. It was something deeper built on shared survival. The FBI kept raiding places based on what Giles told them. They moved fast, hitting locations before anyone could clear out evidence or run. 5 more people got arrested over 2 weeks. The network was bigger than anyone realized. These weren't just random criminals. They had connections in hospitals, transport companies, even funeral homes that helped dispose of evidence. The whole system had been running for years right under everyone's noses. Prosecutor Catalina Richards called us in for a meeting at her office. She spread out files across the conference table showing all the arrests and evidence they'd collected. Her voice was confident when she told us the case was strong enough to guarantee convictions for everyone they'd caught. Even without the corrupt officer in custody, she had enough to put away the doctor, Giles, and everyone else involved in the trafficking network. But then her expression got serious. She said the corrupt officer remained their top priority because he was the most dangerous. He'd killed before to protect the operation, and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. A journalist contacted me through the FBI asking for an interview about the case. I agreed, but only if it stayed anonymous. We met at a coffee shop with Agent Maddie sitting nearby for security. The journalist had kind eyes and listened carefully while I talked about trusting your gut when someone you love goes missing. I told her how everyone dismissed my concerns, and how the police closed the case without really investigating. I wanted other families to know they should push back when something doesn't feel right. Don't just accept easy explanations that don't match who the person really is. The article came out a week later, and people started sharing it everywhere online. Marco showed me his phone with the story pulled up. He'd been doing his own thinking about the future. He told me he was applying to criminal justice programs at different colleges. Watching the FBI work showed him what good police work actually looked like. He wanted to be part of fixing the system instead of just complaining about the corrupt officers who broke it. His applications talked about his brother's kidnapping, and how it changed what he wanted to do with his life. 6 weeks after our rescue, everything changed again. A state trooper 3 states away pulled over a car for a broken taillight, just a routine traffic stop on a Tuesday afternoon. The driver handed over his license, and the trooper walked back to his patrol car to run it. That's when he saw the FBI bulletin with the updated sketch. He looked at the license photo, looked at the sketch, looked at the man sitting in the car ahead of him. Then he called for backup and approached with his hand on his weapon. The corrupt officer tried to reach for something, but 3 more patrol cars arrived before he could move. They pulled him out and cuffed him right there on the side of the highway. Agent Maddie called me the second she got word. Her voice had this edge of relief mixed with satisfaction when she told me it was finally over. The corrupt officer was in custody, and this time there was no way he was getting out. The news broke the next morning. Every channel showed his mugshot with headlines about the trafficking network. Reporters stood outside the courthouse talking about victims and organ harvesting, and how a corrupt cop had protected it all for years. My phone buzzed with texts from people I hadn't heard from in months, everyone suddenly wanting to know details. Agent Maddie called me that afternoon and asked if I wanted to attend her press conference. I said yes immediately. She held it at the FBI field office with cameras everywhere and reporters shouting questions. Agent Maddie stood at the podium and explained how the investigation had worked, how they'd tracked down everyone involved, how the network had operated across 3 states. Then she looked right at the camera and talked about me. She said the case only got solved because I refused to give up on Julie, because I trusted my gut when everyone else said to let it go, because Julie had left those clues at the playground knowing someone would find them. Hearing her say that made something tight in my chest finally loosen. The arraignment happened 3 days later. Marco picked me up early and we drove to meet Julie and Joseph at the courthouse. We all wanted to see him in custody, wanted to watch him stand in front of a judge and answer for what he did. The courtroom was packed with reporters and FBI agents and families of other victims. We sat in the 3rd row and waited. Then they brought him in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked smaller somehow, less scary than when he'd been free and hunting us. His eyes scanned the courtroom and landed on us. He stared for a long moment and I stared right back, refusing to look away first. The judge asked how he pleaded, and his lawyer said not guilty to all charges. Prosecutor Richards stood up and listed everything: kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, organ trafficking, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice. The list went on for 5 full minutes. His lawyer argued for bail, but Prosecutor Richards shot that down fast, talking about flight risk and how he'd already escaped custody once. The judge denied bail and set a preliminary hearing date for 3 weeks out. We all exhaled together when the guards led him away. The preliminary hearing was harder. Julie and Joseph had to take the stand and identify him as one of their captors. Julie went first, and her voice shook at the beginning but got stronger as she talked. She described the basement, the zip ties, the conversations she'd overheard about organ harvesting and selling to desperate patients. She pointed at him when the prosecutor asked if she saw her captor in the courtroom. Joseph testified next and added details about Giles Mercer, about how the 2 of them had worked together, about the threats they'd made. The defense lawyer tried to trip them up with questions about dates and times, but Julie and Joseph stayed consistent. Then they called Giles to testify from prison. He wore an orange jumpsuit too and wouldn't look at the corrupt officer while he talked. Giles described how they'd selected victims, how they'd used the cops' authority to cover tracks, how they'd moved Julie and Joseph between locations to avoid detection. The judge listened to everything and ruled there was enough evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. Prosecutor Richards smiled when the judge said attempted murder and organ trafficking charges would stand. 2 weeks after the preliminary hearing, Agent Maddie invited all 4 of us to the FBI field office. She led us into a conference room where certificates were laid out on the table. They were civilian commendation letters recognizing our role in exposing the trafficking operation. Agent Maddie shook each of our hands and said we'd saved lives by refusing to give up, by following the clues, by being brave enough to conduct that rescue. She said the FBI was closing the investigation now that everyone major was in custody, but the case would never have been solved without us. Marco kept staring at his certificate like he couldn't believe it was real. Julie folded hers carefully and tucked it in her bag. Joseph just smiled and thanked Agent Maddie for everything she'd done. I looked at mine and thought about that day at the playground when I'd found Julie's messages, about how close we'd come to never finding them at all. The next Monday, I returned to the school without a security detail for the first time in 2 months. Walking through the parking lot alone felt strange, like I'd forgotten how to do it. My friends met me at my locker with balloons and a welcome back banner they'd made. It was embarrassing and perfect at the same time. Teachers pulled me aside throughout the day to say they'd give me extensions on everything I'd missed. Some of them hugged me and said they were proud of how I'd fought for Julie. At lunch, my friends wanted to hear everything, but I kept it brief, just hitting the main points. Normal felt good after so long living in fear. Julie started physical therapy the same week to rebuild the strength she'd lost during captivity. Her legs had gotten weaker from being tied up and then lying in a hospital bed. The track coach came to our house and talked to her about modified training. He said if she worked hard, she could compete at state level next spring before starting at MIT. Julie's eyes lit up at that goal. She started going to therapy 3 times a week, doing exercises to strengthen her muscles and improve her endurance. I'd watch her sometimes in the backyard running laps, pushing herself even when she was tired. She was getting faster every week. Joseph wanted to do something special for Julie to celebrate her decision to keep chasing her dreams despite everything. He organized a small gathering at his house with their closest friends, just pizza and music and people who cared about them. I went with Marco and we hung out in the kitchen while Julie and Joseph sat on the couch with their friends. Everyone was relaxed and laughing, making jokes and sharing stories. It was exactly the kind of normal evening they both needed after months of trauma. Julie kept smiling and leaning into Joseph, and he kept his arm around her shoulders like he was afraid to let go. Marco and I started meeting every week after that to talk about how we were processing everything. We'd get coffee or walk around the park and just decompress. He was the only person who really understood what it had felt like to find that house in the woods, to see Julie and Joseph tied up, to run through the dark knowing we might not make it out. We talked about the nightmares we still had and the ways we jumped at sudden noises. Having someone who got it without needing explanations helped more than I'd expected. 7 months after the rescue, the trials finally began. Prosecutor Richards had spent all that time building her case, organizing evidence, preparing witnesses. The disgraced doctor went first since his charges were the most serious. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and I attended every day I could. Prosecutor Richards walked the jury through 12 victims who'd been processed through the operation. She showed medical records and DNA evidence and testimony from survivors. The doctor's lawyer tried to argue he'd been coerced, but the evidence was too strong. The jury convicted him on all counts, and the judge gave him life in prison without parole for his role in multiple deaths during organ harvesting. Giles Mercer's trial was shorter because he'd already agreed to plead guilty in exchange for testifying against the corrupt officer. He stood in front of the judge and admitted to kidnapping, conspiracy, and trafficking. Then he took the stand to describe how the corrupt officer had run the whole operation. Giles talked about victim selection, about how they'd target healthy young people with no strong family connections who wouldn't be missed right away. He explained how the corrupt officer used his badge to dismiss missing persons reports and close cases fast. He described the threats the officer had made when anyone got too curious. The judge sentenced Giles to 25 years, and he was led away looking relieved it wasn't worse. The corrupt officer's trial started 2 weeks later and lasted 3 full weeks. I sat in the courtroom every single day I could, watching as the prosecutor laid out all the evidence against him. Julie testified on the 5th day, walking to the witness stand with her head up and her voice steady. She described the basement, the zip ties cutting into her wrists, the threats he made about harvesting their organs. She never looked at him once during her testimony, just stared straight ahead and answered every question clearly. Joseph testified the next day, explaining how they'd tried to report being followed, and how the corrupt officer himself had taken their report and dismissed it. He talked about waking up in that basement, about hearing the officer laugh while describing what he planned to do to them. The jury listened to every word, some of them looking sick as the details piled up. I testified on day 8, bringing the photos of Julie's messages from the playground. I explained how I'd found each clue, how Marco and I had decoded the coordinates and license plate, how we'd followed the officer to that house in the woods. The prosecutor asked me to describe what I saw through the basement window, and I did, my voice shaking a little when I got to the part about Julie and Joseph tied to chairs. The defense lawyer tried to make it seem like we'd trespassed or acted recklessly, but the prosecutor shut that down fast by pointing out we'd saved 2 lives that night. The trial dragged on with expert witnesses, FBI agents, and people from the trafficking network who'd agreed to testify. Each day felt longer than the last, but I kept showing up because I needed to see this through to the end. The jury got the case on a Friday afternoon, and we all waited through the weekend, nobody sleeping much or able to focus on anything else. Monday morning, they came back with a verdict. Guilty on every single count, including kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and abuse of authority. The courtroom stayed quiet while the judge read the sentence. Life in prison without any chance of parole. The judge said the corrupt officer's betrayal of public trust made his crimes especially terrible, that he'd used his badge to hurt people he was supposed to protect. The officer just stared straight ahead, no expression on his face as they led him away in handcuffs. Julie grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard, and I squeezed back, both of us finally able to breathe, knowing he'd never hurt anyone again. 2 days after the sentencing, Julie got an email from MIT. They'd reconfirmed her acceptance for the following fall semester, giving her the extra time she needed to recover and prepare. She read the email 3 times, then started crying, the good kind of tears that meant relief and hope instead of fear. She spent the next few months working with her track coach to rebuild her strength, running every morning and slowly getting back the speed she'd lost during captivity. Her times improved each week, and she started talking about trying out for MIT's track team once she got there. She filled out housing forms, bought textbooks online, and made lists of everything she needed to pack. Joseph made his decision about a month later. He'd been accepted to a 4-year university about 30 minutes from MIT's campus, close enough to visit Julie regularly, but far enough that they'd each have their own space. He wanted to study music education, planning to become a high school band teacher someday. Julie helped him fill out transfer applications, and they spent hours on video calls looking at apartments he might rent near his campus. Their relationship had changed after everything that happened, gotten deeper and more solid. They weren't just dating anymore. They were partners who'd survived something terrible together and came out stronger. I got invited to speak at a conference on missing persons investigations 3 months after the trial ended. The conference was in a big hotel downtown with law enforcement officers from 6 different states attending. I stood at a podium in front of 200 people and told Julie's story, emphasizing how important it is to listen when families insist something is wrong. I talked about the clues Julie left, about how quickly the local police had closed her case, about what might have happened if I'd given up like everyone told me to. After my speech, at least a dozen officers came up to talk to me. Several police departments asked for copies of my presentation to use in training their staff. A few chiefs admitted their departments had similar problems with dismissing cases too quickly and wanted advice on fixing their protocols. The whole experience felt surreal, like I was somehow making a real difference beyond just saving my sister. Marco got his acceptance letter to his top choice criminal justice program in early spring. He called me right away, so excited he could barely get the words out, and asked if I'd help him move into his dorm when the time came. Move-in day arrived in late August, hot and humid with the sun beating down on the parking lot. We carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs, setting up his room with posters and books and the mini fridge his mom insisted he needed. We took a break sitting on his bed, both of us sweating and tired, and he said something about how strange it was that something so terrible had led to such good changes in our lives. I knew what he meant. Neither of us would have chosen what happened, but it had pushed us both toward paths we might not have found otherwise. Julie left for MIT a week later with our whole family making the drive to campus. Mom cried the entire way there. Dad kept clearing his throat like he was fighting back tears, and I sat in the back seat watching the miles pass. We helped Julie move into her dorm, meeting her roommate and hanging pictures on the walls and making sure she had everything she needed. When it was time to say goodbye, Julie hugged each of us for a long time. She promised to call every day at first, and I promised to visit once she got settled into her routine. We both knew our bond was even stronger now than it had been before, forged through the worst experience of our lives and the relief of surviving it. I started my senior year of high school 2 weeks later feeling completely different from I had the year before. I walked into classes with confidence, knowing I could trust my instincts and make things happen when I needed to. My college essays practically wrote themselves. All of them focused on advocacy and criminal justice reform and the importance of never giving up on people you love. Teachers who'd known me since freshman year commented on how much I'd changed, how I seemed more focused and determined. I applied to schools with strong criminal justice programs, already planning a career path that would let me help other families like mine. Agent Maddie called me in October with news about policy changes. The FBI's investigation into Julie's case had led to new rules for how local police departments handle missing persons reports. Now there were mandatory review protocols and outside oversight when cases got closed quickly, especially if families were raising concerns. She said Julie's case would help protect other families from similar failures, that the changes would probably save lives. Hearing that made everything we'd been through feel like it mattered beyond just our own family, like maybe some good really could come from something so terrible. Joseph started at his new university and joined an advocacy group for trafficking survivors within the first month. He used his experience to help other people navigate trauma and recovery, running support group meetings and speaking to classes about recognizing the signs of trafficking. He and Julie video chatted every single day, sometimes for hours, maintaining their connection despite going to different schools. He visited her campus most weekends, and she took the train to see him when she could. They were building a life together slowly, both of them healing while supporting each other's dreams and goals for the future. 1 year after the rescue, my parents hosted a celebration dinner at our house with Joseph's family joining us around the big dining table. Julie looked healthy and strong, her MIT sweatshirt worn with pride as she talked about her engineering classes and the friends she'd made on campus. Joseph sat beside her, their hands linked on the table, and he shared stories about his music education program and the student orchestra he'd joined. Marco arrived late from his criminal justice classes, apologizing as he squeezed into a chair and immediately started asking Julie and Joseph about their semester. My acceptance letters were spread across the kitchen counter, scholarships from 3 different schools that wanted me for their advocacy programs. Mom kept tearing up every time someone mentioned how far we'd all come, and Dad raised his glass multiple times to toast our resilience and healing. The dinner felt different from our old family gatherings, marked by an awareness of how close we'd come to losing everything, but also filled with genuine joy about the futures we were all building. After everyone left, I drove to the secret playground alone, parking in the same spot I'd used that day when I was desperate and crying on the swings. I walked over to the swing set pole and ran my fingers across the metal where Julie had written her coded messages in black permanent marker. The words had faded over the year, worn away by weather and time, but I could still make out traces of her distinctive handwriting with the dots inside the P's and D's. I sat on the swing and pushed off gently, looking around at the playground that had changed everything. This place had given me the clues I needed when everyone else had given up, when the corrupt officer had dismissed the case and our parents had accepted the runaway story. Julie's desperate messages scratched into metal had saved her life, and Joseph's life, had exposed an organ trafficking ring, had led to policy changes that would protect other families. I thought about how close I'd come to giving up myself, how easy it would have been to listen to Marco's initial dismissal, or the officer's wave off, or everyone's insistence that they'd just run away together. But I'd trusted my instincts about my sister, had refused to accept explanations that didn't fit the person I knew, had kept searching when it seemed pointless. That decision, that refusal to give up on someone I loved, had literally saved lives.